So welcome to our last Freshwater Stewardship Community webinar of the year. We are very excited to have Melissa here with us tonight, and we are going to be going through her presentation. It's going to be the bulk of the evening tonight. We will have some time at the end for the Q&A, and then also a special year-end event that we're hosting that we will announce at the end of the night. So the two people with you tonight are Melissa, obviously our wonderful speaker, and her contact information is up on the screen. And Darlene is going to be kind of facilitating part of this webinar as well. And she is Watersheds Canada's Environmental Policy and Planning Intern. My name is Monica. I'm not on the screen because I'm really here just as a facilitator on the back end. So if you're having any troubles with your technology or you have any questions for the Q&A, you can submit those to me through Zoom. You can either post it to the group publicly or you can private message it to me. So a bit about the community that has taken part over this whole year is the Freshwater Stewardship Community, launched in January of 2021. This has been a really great way for Watersheds Canada to reach out to different community groups, individuals across the country and really across the world, and be able to equip people who are worried about their freshwater or looking to take action with some different webinars and education resources. So everything that has happened this year is currently archived on our website. There are talks from Birds Canada, Water Rangers, the River Institute, Invasive Species Center, covering a wide range of topics like education for your family and things like invasive species, plant identification, and water quality issues. So we really encourage you, if you haven't already looked at all of those resources, they are available for free at watersheds.ca/freshwater-stewardship. And of course, the recording from tonight will make its way onto that site as well. And we would like to thank the SM Blair Family Foundation for funding this community this year. And I will pass it off to Darlene to talk more about our Planning for Our Shorelines project.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the Planning for Our Shorelines project, because that's kind of how today's talk kind of came to be. So this project was largely driven by a stakeholder survey called The Future of Our Shores. We sent this out earlier in the year, and we received almost 200 responses from representatives of lake associations, planners, and municipal elected officials. And its goal was to find out what the barriers are to shoreline stewardship and the factors influencing the use of a best management practices resource. And if you have some time, I would encourage you to check it out. It's got some really good information about what is needed to protect our shorelines and what some of the weaknesses currently are. And that's available on watersheds.ca. The Planning for Our Shorelines is a planning and policy program aimed at helping municipal decision makers sustainably manage their shorelines through strong and enforceable policy. So the way we want to do this is twofold. The first one is by creating a website highlighting the science of natural shorelines and their social, economic, and environmental significance, and then highlighting best management practices of innovative municipal policies governing this issue. The second is hosting a series of online discussion forums where planners can come together and discuss some of the common but complex issues their townships are faced with. And this is a space where planners can offer their own experiences and openly discuss different mechanisms to sustainable shoreline development. Can I go to the next slide, please, Monica? So this project has been a collaborative effort from the very beginning. So we have a wonderful steering committee with representatives from environmental organizations, conservation authorities, cottage associations, certified planners, previous municipal staff, lake stewards, the whole works. And it also wouldn't be possible to achieve without the help of some of our funders. The next slide. So there is this misconception that in Canada that when you buy a property, you can do whatever you want on it. And this isn't really true. Especially as a waterfront property owner, there's a responsibility because what you do adjacent to a water body has direct impacts on the beauty and the enjoyment of the lake, which is something that nobody owns. So, and although you may own the land on paper, the land and water will continue to exist long after you sell that property, which is why we have bylaws to regulate shoreline activity and development so it can be enjoyed for the long term and over generations. However, during the pandemic, the issue of shoreline development and regulation has gotten a lot of attention recently. Originally, this talk today was intended to be presented to municipal planners who are experiencing troubles enforcing sustainable shoreline development. But policy is something that people are not only interested, but quite invested in. So we thought we would open this presentation up to the public to hear about some of the unique mechanisms being used at Lake of Bays, which brings me to our guest speaker tonight. But before I introduce her, I just want to mention that if you do have questions during the presentation, just feel free to drop them in the discussion box, and then we can relay them to Melissa after her presentation. But in the interest of time, I would encourage you to keep your questions concise with the question itself and leave the unnecessary stories alone. We want to keep the questions very general to appeal to everyone and not just people's specific circumstances. So with that being said, I want to introduce Melissa Markham. She is a professional planner with experience in shoreline protection policies. She was the director of planning for the Township of Lake of Bays for almost 5 years. And Lake of Bays uses the Community Planet Permit System, the CPPS, and was one of the first municipalities to implement this system for waterfront development. Prior to this position, she worked in the GTA for both municipal and private offices. Melissa has experience with zoning bylaws and most recently worked on a community planning permit bylaw that will be implemented to protect vegetation across an entire municipality. So with that being said, Melissa, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, everybody. So I'm gonna share my screen here and get my presentation up. Oh. Perfect, I hope everybody can see that. So I just wanted to thank Watersheds Canada for having me here. So I think that I'm here today because Darlene had mentioned different work that they've been doing through Watersheds Canada, but it's also because we had a conversation a few months ago about the uniqueness of the Township of Lake of Bays. So first of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming and giving up your Wednesday night to listen to what I have to talk about from a planning perspective and how we do that shoreline protection and community planning permit system. And the example I'll be using is the Township of Lake of Bays. I have also been informed that you're not all planners, so I'm going to provide an overview of a community planning permit system, and I will be using the term community planning permit system and development permit system interchangeably because the Township of Lake of Bays does have a development permit system, and hopefully at some point the community planning permit bylaw, which is the newer name for the development permit system, will be in effect. So I guess as Darlene had mentioned, over the past 5 years, I've learned how the community planning permit system works in a waterfront community. I've spoken to many people about my experiences with this tool, and I've been approached by planners in many different municipalities, along with lake associations who are looking at how they can better protect the shorelines in their municipalities. So from this perspective, that will be my only example that I'll be using is Lake of Bays, as it's the only place that I've used this tool. I'm a land use planner, as Darlene mentioned, with experience in urban planning and now rural planning. And the information I'll give you tonight is based solely on my experience in Lake of Bays. As you heard, I was the director of planning for the Township of Lake of Bays for almost 5 years, where I used this tool. And as Darlene also mentioned, I had been the author of the new community planning permit system for the municipality. And what that's going to do is broaden the development permit system into the entire municipality for vegetation protection. So what is the community planning permit system? So as I said, I'd be using the terms development permit and community planning permit system interchangeably in my presentation. What the community planning permit system is, it's a planning tool that's given to us through the Planning Act. So for the people that aren't planners, this is one of the mechanisms such as zoning, minor variances. The Planning Act allows municipalities to use to regulate land use within a certain area. What this process does is it's trying to streamline the planning process. It's a faster turnaround with Planning Act timelines. It's a 45-day process. And it also streamlines the process to combine zoning bylaw amendments, site plans, and minor variances. So even if you aren't a planner, maybe you've gone through the planning process before and some of those terms are familiar with you. But essentially the use of the community planning permit system in Lake of Bays was to protect environmental features in their shoreline areas. So some people are probably more familiar with what is a zoning bylaw. That would be the traditional zoning bylaw that you would see in almost all municipalities throughout Ontario. Zoning bylaw differs from a community planning permit system, and I'll go through the different ways that it's different, and it definitely looks different than a standard zoning bylaw that you'd be familiar with. The definition of development is different in a community planning permit system than a zoning bylaw. The process of how applications are treated, the uses as they're set out, provisions, delegated authority, conditions that can be attached to a development permit, which is something that's going to be very important for shoreline protection, and also the appeals. So as I said, my presentation is going to be twofold, kind of providing an overview of the community planning permit system, and then also why Lake of Bays is a situation that, that this works well in. So as I mentioned, the first difference that is given for a community planning permit system is the definition of development. So this is taken straight from the Planning Act. So no, I won't have to read through all of the terms that we have here. It's definitely cut and paste. But what I'll bring your attention to, so this is a definition that applies to site planning within the Planning Act. When you get to the development permit system or a community planning permit system, if you look at the bottom, there's a square that I've highlighted. As you can see under D and E, two additional definitions have been added under development. Development includes site alteration, including but not limited to the alteration of the grade of land and placing or dumping of fill, or the removal of vegetation. So right there, that is key. Only in a community planning permit system in the province of Ontario in the Planning Act does development include site alteration and the removal of vegetation. So right there, that's one of the biggest differences that you'll see in this system. The next, which I'll go over very quickly because it's not as important, I kind of touched on it, a zoning bylaw. If you're familiar with that, you'd have a zoning amendment, minor variances. Typically in a waterfront area, you'd be going through site plan approval after you've gone through that, and then you'd be going to building permit. Once again, there's also timelines, as I mentioned at the beginning, a community planning permit systems to streamline the process. So zoning bylaw amendment could be 90 days, then you tie on a site plan approval, which would be another 30 days after that, and a building permit. Whereas you look at the other side, the right-hand side there, the development permit bylaw, there's just a development permit, which has a 45-day turnaround straight to building permit. So it's to streamline all of those into one. Now, the way that can happen is because the bylaw, and this is Lake of Bays specific, and I'm not sure how many times I'm going to say that today, but this is definitely Lake of Bays specific in terms of how things are looked at. So a standard bylaw would have permitted uses that you can have in a zone. And this is where we talk about some of those other Planning Act requirements, like minor variance. Let's say you want a use that isn't permitted in the list, you would go through a minor variance, typically in order to permit something that's kind of similar. Through this process in Lake of Bays, it's set up, as you can see on the top of the screen, permitted uses. I grabbed the waterfront environmental protection area just as an example, but in a WEP, there'd be an existing detached dwelling and conservation, which are permitted as a right. And in a WEP1, typically your type 1 fish habitat, permitted would be conservation, an existing dock, and an expansion to an existing dock associated with an abutting property. So in Lake of Bays, the lake is actually zoned WEP1. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a discretionary use. So this is interesting that, there's no minor variance for something similar. This is a discretionary use that goes through the planning process, and these can be permitted as long as they meet certain criteria as a right on the property. So as you can see under discretionary use for WEP, you could have a new dock, a boathouse, a boat port, or similar uses to those permitted. So this is how you're tying in like a minor variance. It's be a little bit different. You don't need to go through that additional process where you have to go through a committee approval. A discretionary use could be permitted by staff through the Township of Lake of Bays as a discretionary use. Now, that being said, the WEP as well, also, or WEP1 speaks of a new dock and boathouse. So there are some conditions that need to be met in terms of how these can be allowed, but this streamlines the process. Typically, these types of uses, the A that you're seeing there and the B, would require a fish habitat assessment. So if you're used to seeing zoning bylaws, this bylaw looks a little bit different as the development permit bylaw. The next difference that you're going to see, oh, sorry, yep.
There's a little banner at the bottom of your page about sharing. I wonder if you can click hide because the words from the bottom of that last slide were cut off. Thanks.
I can go back. I thought it was just on my screen. You can cut me off if there's anything else as we're going through this. Okay, so as you can see here in the WEP1 at the bottom, a new dock, boathouse, or boatport associated with a new or existing dwelling. So just the example there is that they're discretionary uses. So they're not permitted as a right. You'd have to meet some criteria in order to get it, but it's set out in the bylaw what you can have. Once again, this is also fairly clear to people as well in terms of what they can and can't do with their property. So the next one here is provisions. So provisions within a community planning permit bylaw are different than zoning bylaw. As you can see here as well, it's in a chart form. So this is once again pulled from the waterfront environmental protection development permit area. And you can see a side yard setback here. You see a staff variation. Staff can vary up to 50% of the standard that you're allowed, and council can vary over 50. And I know I'm getting into technical things here from a planning perspective. I just want to set out the fact that in this bylaw, it's not concrete. There is some variability within approvals that can be granted. So that being said, the provisions here are set out if somebody, has a specific situation where they can't comply with the side yard setback, they could apply either to staff for that variation in that number up to 50%, as long as, once again, there's criteria for that, or they go to council. All of these, once again, are 45-day windows for approvals. So one of the other things that, as I mentioned, staff has the ability to vary this. So once again, no committee, no council. This would be an application which is essentially delegated to staff in order to review the application and either approve or deny. And I'll get through some of the other approvals and how things are dealt with in the development permit bylaw a little bit later, but there is delegated authority through this bylaw for staff to approve certain criteria. Once again, there is criteria that's applied. Just because you apply for a staff variation doesn't mean that you get it. However, you have that ability, and staff are delegated that authority to do that. So staff variations need to be appropriate for the lands, not have any off-site impacts, and similar to a minor variance for the planners out there, they have to maintain the general intent and purpose of the official plan and the bylaw. No sign or circulations required to neighbors for this. If you're going forward for a council variation, the criteria that would be set out is very similar. It has to be appropriate for the lands. However, in this situation, you just need to mitigate any off-site impacts on the property in order for that to be deemed something that would be appropriate. Once again, also maintain the general intent and purpose of the official plan and bylaw. Council variations are circulated to neighbors, and a sign is posted on the property. The other unique aspect of the community planning permit system, as I mentioned before, would be the appeals. One thing about this system is that third-party appeals are not permitted to the development permit bylaw. So only if you're the owner of the property can you appeal a decision that's made. So while the council variations would be circulated for comment, adjacent property owners or anybody other than the owner does not have the ability to appeal a development permit. So that being said, you can also approve applications with conditions. So as I said, I'm trying to go through the bylaw pretty quickly because it is somewhat technical, but I think it is really interesting for other planners out there to see exactly how this system works. So when you're going through the process, you can approve an application with conditions attached to it. So I know these days you can do zoning with conditions, but this is something that's set out, and the list of conditions that can be attached to an application are included within the bylaw. So the first thing that staff can do is provisionally approve an application. So we could look at something and say, okay, this meets the intent. However, you need a site evaluation because there's steep slopes. So that's, I've listed there. So that could be a condition that could be attached to an application, and only at such time as you've received a site evaluation that is in favor of the development would that be issued. So it's gone through the 45-day process, but there would be a conditional approval given. There could also be an application that's refused, so they're not always approved. You could approve an application with no conditions attached, or you can approve something with a condition that no vegetation be removed. So I've listed some things here. When a permit's required, the following could be imposed. As I said, there's a much more exhaustive list within the bylaw, but one of the main ones that's used within the township is the maintenance or restoration of shoreline vegetation. So this is a condition. You can require a planting plan, and then afterwards you can require that that planting plan be implemented and that the trees or any vegetation that's planted be maintained on the property. You can allow lighting to minimize impacts on lake views and night skies. So that is a standard that's within the Township of Lake of Bays. If you need a study for the planners out there, if there's any studies like deer wintering, steep slopes, wildland fire, they could be a condition of approval. So they aren't actually required as part of a complete application at the beginning of the process. And then another one, as I said, going through the waterfront environmental protection zone, that you'd require a fish habitat assessment for a lot containing or abutting the type 1 or unknown fish habitat. So it's interesting that you can approve something, but there would be conditions attached to that. And once again, the owner could appeal the conditions that are put onto the property. Nobody else could appeal that. So this is where I'll get into why Lake of Bays. And, I was kind of chatting with some of the ladies from Watersheds Canada before this and just kind of laying out, I think Lake of Bays was a prime example for why the development permit system could work in such a small municipality. The first official plan for the Township of Lake of Bays was in 1999. Prior to this, Lake of Bays was a secondary plan. For those of you that know, Lake of Bays is a lower tier municipality within the district of Muskoka. So prior to 1999, the Lake of Bays was a secondary plan in Muskoka. In 1999, the township did adopt its own official plan. Now, through this process, there was a lot of community engagement, a lot of engagement. The official plan essentially that's in place today has been, tweaked over time, but the vision, the purpose of the plan maintains the same as that 1999 plan that was adopted. The vision, and this is, like I said, this is getting back to why why Lake of Bays and why it works. The vision that was incorporated into the Township of Lake of Bays official plan was done by and for the community as part of the plan. It identified the characteristics that made Lake of Bays a special place to live and visit. And in the official plan, it states that the characteristics and elements that form the basic character which defines the township and creates a sense of identity. The vision provides an image of the township that is desired for the future, identifies basic community values, and sets forth the qualities and features that should be preserved over time. So that being said, the vision for the Township of Lake of Bays, which was set out in 1999, is that the residents of the Township of Lake of Bays will nurture and sustain clean water, fresh air, natural shorelines, healthy forests, and wetlands that will be the pride of the province. They will offer an outstanding combination of economic opportunity, peaceful living, and recreation. This is our dream and legacy for our grandchildren's children. So I think those words right there, and truthfully, if you go and look at the Township of Lake of Bays official plan, that vision is in that official plan. I think those words and the fact that that formed the policies that kind of came with Lake of Bays developing its own official plan. All of the underlying principles in the Lake of Bays official plan come from this vision. And that leads into, in 2000 and 2001, the province of Ontario was looking to conduct a demonstration project to determine how a development permit system might work in a waterfront community. So, while we get later on maybe into some challenges and opportunities and how this could work in other places, I feel like because the timing of how Lake of Bays came together, like I said, with that 1999 community, huge support of the environment and what they wanted to see and how they wanted to see Lake of Bays develop, in line with the province looking for a municipality who could bring a development permit system forward with the intent that It will be a streamlined process. It's a logical extension of all of those environmental policies that were in the township's official plan. It offered a mechanism to implement the policies of the official plan. It offered, once again, the streamline, but it also offered the ability in a smaller municipality where, obviously wherever planners go, we're criticized for, changing the rules, people not understanding what planning is requiring. But as I showed you through this bylaw, it's trying to be as clear and concise as possible for what approvals could go through the process, what you'd be looking at, and the rules to how applications are viewed. So I think it's the timing aspect in the municipality that really brought forward the development permit system. And once again, it kind of piggybacked off of those groups that were formed with the official plan of Lake of Bays. Those same community groups continued through the process for the development permit system to mold that for the municipality to really do what its intent was. So like I said, it had the momentum from the official plan and it continued through. Not saying it can't be used other places. I'm just showing exactly how Lake of Bays kind of implemented this and why I believe it was one of the first municipalities based on the timing that that happened. And once again, if you go back, that's 2000 where Lake of Bays started doing this system. So official plan policies, I'm not really going to take you through many of the policies. They speak for themselves. If you go onto the Township of Lake of Bays website and look at their environmental policies, you're going to see quite a few sections dealing with shoreline protection. If you go through the official plan and do one of those find features, you see character. That word comes up a lot more than I've ever seen in an official plan. The environment. There's a lot of key terms in Lake of Bays that you don't see through a lot of other official plans. But the District of Muskoka had prepared a report about shoreline vegetated buffers. I believe this was back in 2003. And through that, it was looking at the interrelationship between a lake and a shoreline and how important that is. The shoreline zone is the last line of defense against the forces that may otherwise destroy a healthy lake. I guess, most of us here tonight obviously believe in shoreline protection, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not an ecologist, I don't pretend to be, I'm a land use planner, but, from what we look at through planning policy and kind of what the background information is that leads to the policies that we have, naturally vegetated shoreline buffers are really, they filter the runoff generated by surrounding land uses that would be caused through development, that removes harmful chemicals and nutrients before they go into the lake. And at the same time, it also does protect lake edges from the onslaught of erosion from, waves and ice. So the township's official plan speaks about the transition between that high water mark and the upland vegetation. So I know that this term is used in the report. It's also used in the Township of Lake of Bays official plan, not as a policy, but it's in a text box ahead of time. And it speaks about the ribbon of life. And the ribbon of life that the Township of Lake of Bays uses is a 20-meter setback. So while the buffer itself, so I guess this is where we're going to look something different. A buffer is looking at protection of vegetation, setback from that, high water mark. A setback of 20 meters. Setbacks are for development, but it's the buffer that really the municipality is trying to protect. By having a 20-meter setback for development, it allows for a 15-meter buffer to be kept in place on properties within the municipality. So these buffers are forested or vegetated strips of land. They border the creeks, rivers, and lakes. And once again, they help filter sediment and erosion that can happen in these areas. And like I said, a buffer is different. It's a development setback, is that ribbon of life. The 20 meters was chosen. And I know there's lots of science out there that speaks to different setbacks for what's the best for lakes. I believe on a standard flat piece of property, which we don't really have many of those in Muskoka, but that 20 meters tends to be the setback that's used for development in the municipality, unless you're in type 1 fish habitat, and then you're going back to 30 meters. However, in both cases, 15 meters is the buffer that's required. So the township recognizes it's also not possible all the time to meet that 20 meters. And in the official plan policies for the township, they require certain conditions to be met for lesser setbacks. So once again, this is 20 meters setback in an official plan policy. So it's very specific. And it talks about when you can't achieve that 20-meter setback, that there's certain criteria for a lesser setback. such as upgrading your sewage system, a planting program, which would be required, relocating other buildings outside of the shoreline area, or a net improvement to the environment. The official plan also includes policy for the preservation and restoration of natural shorelines and requires a minimum target of 75% of the shoreline frontage to be maintained in a natural state. That's to a target depth of that 15-meter buffer that I was speaking about. So once again, these are targets and numbers, concrete, that are set out in the official plan, which in my opinion is unique in a municipality to have this specific of numbers and requirements in an official plan. Those policies, once again, they're in section D of the Township of Lake of Bays official plan, if that's something that you'd be interested in looking at more. Once again, you know, the time I was given today, I was mentioning to Darlene, I could speak about the community planning permit system for quite a lot longer than what I have here tonight, but there's a lot of information that I'm trying to get out in a short period of time, so just trying to condense some things. So I think that the next thing is really where I'm going to spend a lot more of my time. So what you have on your screen in front of you here are 3 different development permit applications that would have been dealt with at the Township of Lake of Bays. So this is just an example. I did mention you have 45 days within the municipality in which to receive an application for staff variation. As I mentioned, it doesn't have to go to council, but if it does go to council, you know, for the planners out there, try and wrap your head around. It's kind of like a minor variance application where you're bringing these plans to council on a monthly basis. So depending on what time in the month you receive an application, the turnaround on getting development permits to council and approved is pretty tight. So the staff that I had at the Township of Lake of Bays are amazing. Truly, they work so hard. You try and go out to a property, you develop a site plan, and you have to have something that it's not a site plan. It's a development permit. So, but it still has to be specific. You still have to be able to relate back to this. For your planning in order to see what was approved on the property. So I think what I'll take you through here is maybe, once again, the development permit system is very specific in terms of its shoreline setbacks. So I think first of all, I'll touch on the fact that what staff do in these development permits that are being issued. It's the protection of the vegetation. And you can see these are just 3 of the examples that I pulled. I'm not certain if they're the best examples that we had out there, but these are just ones that would show what a development permit in use in practice is actually achieving. So the green shows vegetation that is existing, and also through a development permit, this vegetation is to remain on the property. So you can see that I don't know what you call that shape, but the highlighted green section on all 3 development permits that you see here is that all vegetation within the area is to remain and be unmanicured. And once again, through development and a community planning permit system, you can require all of that vegetation to be kept because it's defined as development within this system. So all of that is to be maintained on the property. On the areas, the 2 on either side, if you can see the lines, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see my mouse here. So here on the one on the left, you've got a big area here, which is dashed lines in like a yellowy orange. Through a development permit application for, it looks here like they were putting on an addition on the shoreline yard. This is the lake here, and potentially a new dock and shed. Because they're doing work in that shoreline area, staff could ask for this entire area to be replanted on the property. This would then bring the property more in conformity with that 75% target of shorelines to be vegetated. And in some cases, I'm not sure, there's one here, I guess, the center one with purple. This isn't replanting. This is an area to be left to reestablish, to revegetate naturally. So, you know, there's options within the development permit system for planting, and also just to require the owner to leave these areas in a natural state. So those are, you know, things through the actual implementation of the development permit to achieve those policies in the official plan. This is the implementation of that. So you can see that there's different development going on in these areas. The one thing, so this is, you need to work with the development permit bylaw for a while to learn all the different terms, but this is why I grabbed this one here for the middle. And we won't really necessarily look at the numbers, but what I'm going to try and explain to you is also how the shoreline area within the municipality is protected. I don't know if you can read it on your screen, but it talks about a proposed SAA frontage. So It's right up here in the top of the property. It shows here it's on Peninsula Lake. So SAA is your shoreline activity area. So in this instance, it's definitely larger than what would be permitted for new development, but staff look at this area here as where you're allowed to have any development on your property. I think you'll notice here as well in the sketch, shoreline activity area frontage. This is the area where you're allowed to have development within your shoreline, as I mentioned, that the 20-meter setback from the lake. And that's why staff's asking for this other area to be replanted, because it obviously right now their shoreline in this instance is much larger than that 25%. So there's calculations in terms of how wide of an area you're permitted to have on a property. And then within that shoreline activity area, there's also a percentage of coverage that you're allowed to have. So you have to ensure that, you know, within 20 meters of the lake that there isn't too much development on the shoreline. So on top of all the other policies, the replanting that we have, these are calculations that they use within the Township of Lake Bays to ensure, like I said, the implementation of those policies dealing with shoreline protection. And as I mentioned, these would be the conditional approvals that they would be required to have planting plans that would be submitted with an application. And at that point, you have 2 years in which to actually plant the areas that are shown. In this instance here in the middle, you know, people could go back out and take a look and see whether that's been, you know, cut down or left to revegetate. So that still could be a bylaw enforcement thing if it's not, you know, you're not looking for replanting, but you're asking for people probably to stop cutting the grass in that area. So this is really the implementation of the community planning permit system in Lake Bays through 3 different situations. So you can see that vegetation is definitely something that's being looked at on all of these properties in terms of maintaining that. And it's something, as I said, the definition of development within a community planning permit system allows you to do that. So there's a lot more information in terms of how those calculations are done, but I think, like I said, these give you the visuals in terms of how that could actually be implemented. And also, once again, council can maybe make a decision on a council variation for additional development in this area, but you know, it's offset by that net gain of additional planting. So there is a win there for the municipality as well, and they can see that on the application as it's brought forward. So I'm going to go quickly through the challenges and benefits. And I think maybe the best thing we could do is also get to some questions, because I'm not, you know, there's a lot of information here, and I'm really interested to see on, you know, people's questions on this, whether it's from the actual system itself or whether it's Lake Bays. But, you know, I think that we kind of touched on it before in terms of why did it work for Lake Bays? And I think timing's everything in most situations, but that's not to say that it can't happen in other municipalities. I think the biggest challenge that that happened through the beginning of this process was education. I think word is spreading. I have spoken to many people over my 5 years. I know people are out there looking at this system to see how it can work for their municipality. But education is definitely the key point. That would be a challenge. It's, you know, the general public. It would be consultants, builders, people that are working with the system. That would be definitely a challenge. Regulation. So I think I've mentioned it's council that approves this. So in Lake Bays, there's no committee. So there's a planning council that's set up specifically to look at variations. So that would be another challenge as well, is kind of addressing how would you set up your own council in order to deal with those variations. And I can also mention that there's Huntsville, which is just next door to Lake Bays. It's looking at it, and I believe that they're looking at a committee system, so maybe that won't be a challenge anymore, but that's one, if you're interested in the community planning permit system, keep an eye on Huntsville. They're just going through their public process now. But I'd say that the benefits outweigh the challenges in many instances, and it would be more protection for the natural environment, because you can regulate site alteration and vegetation removal. You get the revegetation of shorelines. It would be the decreased processing times. Now, obviously, the challenge that goes along with that is the staff that you have to do this in the first place. From some of the public's perspective, I guess, one of the benefits would be no third-party appeals to applications. It's definitely streamlined. There's flexibility in terms of uses and delegation to staff. So those would be some of the benefits that we can see, I guess, through this process. But once again, I think that I'm interested to see what anybody's questions are. So that's really the last slide that I would go to, would be questions. And yeah, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go back to maybe Darlene if she's going to facilitate the questions.
So I can start with some of the questions that people, maybe I'll just, there we
That's
go.
me.
I will go through the questions. Some people submitted them through their registration form. So we'll go through those first, and then we'll just work our way as best we can through all the other questions in the chat. So the first one is, if a permit is needed to shore up waterfront eroded by weather or large wakes.
So I guess one thing I figured I wouldn't mention, but, and I had in Muskoka as well, and once again, I'm only speaking as when I was the director of planning in Lake of Bays, there's no conservation authority in Muskoka. So when you're looking at any regulations for any works that are being done in the water, really you've got the municipality on land, and you'd be dealing with MNRF for anything you'd be doing in the water for shoring things up. I will say that the township has policy about shoring up your water, and that isn't something that would be they don't look favorably. There's policy that speaks to the fact that obviously vegetation along your shoreline is your best defense against erosion. So the only thing I could say is if you were doing something like that, you would most likely be limited to that 25% shoreline activity area frontage that would be permitted through the bylaw. Anything, even shoring up wall in the waterfront would increase where your activity area is. So that wouldn't be permitted outside the 25%.
Great. And a number of people are asking about enforcement, so both in the short term and the long term.
Sorry, Monica, you cut out for a second there. I don't think I caught the whole thing.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that a number of people have been asking about enforcement, both on a short-term scale and long-term.
So that's one thing as well. So the community planning permit system is definitely different than a zoning bylaw. And it's also different than a tree removal bylaw that you might have in a municipality. So any of your enforcement on the bylaw is solely set out in the bylaw itself. So you do not have any of those additional charges that could be laid outside of what the Planning Act would allow. So that is one of the issues that I've actually come across within the municipality in the last year is what happens when people take those trees out, where's the enforcement and what charges can be laid. They're the Planning Act charges that can come into effect. There's nothing above that. But still bylaw enforcement, bylaw goes out, the development permit is just as enforceable as a site plan, and they can go out and ensure that the trees are where they're supposed to be and development's in the same location.
Perfect. So I think now we'll go through the questions that are in the chat, and I'll do my best to remember what slide people asked them at. So the first one is, if maintenance or restoration is required as a condition requiring ongoing compliance. Oh, that one I think we just answered. Never mind. Darlene answered one about vision statements and how they're quite standard in official plans. That was a great question. Someone is wondering if vegetation includes canopy and ground cover. So I think that's when you were showing your different examples of the areas that were in green.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that would be, the image itself would include more of the canopy as well. But one of the things that, I guess, going to a challenge or one of the things that was implemented at the beginning of the development permit system is there was the ability to remove vegetation one time for every property. And there was a 10% of the vegetation on the property could be removed. I think this was because it was a new system and people weren't used to what they would be allowed and not allowed to do. So I think what we'd be looking at that point is anything less than 6 feet would be something that would be, anything greater than 6 feet would be looked at as vegetation in that instance. There is a minimum size of trees that would be considered vegetation that when it's removed, there would be issues with that. But the images in the development permit itself, that would include more of a canopy. And it's not, a survey sketch. That would be more just staff's interpretation of what was there at the time, if that helps.
There are a couple questions about the discretion for staff. So what kind of training are they receiving? Who's qualified to make these sketches, the planting plans that you were mentioning?
Yeah, so there's a few questions there. So it would be through planning that the development permits would be issued. So I was just there until about a month ago. So what Lake of Bays is set up with 2 planners. So it would be a director, there would be a planner, and 2 planning techs. So that would be who would be overseeing the staff delegation, because obviously it would be through the bylaw in terms of whether it meets the intent of the official plan and bylaw, no offsite impacts, and it's appropriate for the development. So that would be a planner that would be making that determination. The planting plans are submitted typically by, if there's removal of trees, then typically it would be an arborist that the municipality would be looking for a sign as to why something, or a letter as to why something had to come down. But a lot of the local garden centers would be developing the planting plans with native species for residents to submit to the municipality. Also, along with that, there's a deposit for every stem as well, which is how, as soon as they're planted, they'd get that deposit back. But there's a density of trees as well within the bylaw, which we would be looking at for replantings in the municipality. So they need to ensure that.
Okay, and then for the example of Lake of Bays, do you know of any training that staff had to go through before they were able to go out and do the work and have that kind of freedom and discretion when they go to each property?
No, like I said, that would be myself and the other planner that we'd be looking at. It's no difference than making a planning opinion on other planning applications that come through. So that is how that was done. So I guess, would there be a concern? Maybe, I guess, too bad we can't have a back and forth here in terms of the concern as to the authority that staff would be delegated. I think it's common in other municipalities too, for delegated authority to staff for other planning applications. Consents is one of them, removal of holds in some instances. There's staff delegated authority for other Planning Act applications as well. And in this instance, yes, it would be the planning staff that would be making that determination.
Okay. Someone is wondering how significant you would say the involvement of the Lake of Bays Association was during the process of developing the program.
So I wasn't at the municipality when all of this happened, but I would believe that that would be one of the lake associations that would have been key in in participating throughout the official plan and the development permit bylaw. They also have been involved in the new community planning permit bylaw that's been drafted for the municipality.
Okay, and then one that is kind of going on in Haliburton right now is the debate about the draft shoreline preservation bylaws. So one of the claims with that is that from the development industry is that a prior permitting system would kill the shoreline landscaping industry. So what do you think has been the reception by landscapers and builders, and has it had a negative impact on the industry for Lake of Bays, for example?
Sorry, just so the question is,
so
needing permits before they do the work? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, a prior permitting system would kill the shoreline landscaping industry.
I think it's, like I said, one of the challenges at the beginning of the process is education. And I think over time, contractors that do work, it's no different than needing a building permit before you'd be doing something else. It would be a planning permit. And I think that's why the community planning permit terminology is going to be a lot better than development permit, because it's a planning permit. Any landscapers that would be doing work within the shoreline, any work that is conducted within the shoreline in the township of Lake of Bays requires a development permit. So there's just been education over time to ensure that the people that are being hired to do this work are aware of what they are permitted and not permitted to do. And there have been, many instances of landscapers being, that there's work being done on properties where there's been stop work orders because it's not permitted. So I think that really it's just education and going through a process like that of people recognizing what they can and can't do. I think and a lot of municipalities, I don't know, maybe I could just speak for the township. I think the flagstone patios, I think the landscaping that's being done in the shoreline is becoming more and more. And I think that, shorelines, just because there's an activity area where you can have development doesn't necessarily mean that that whole area should be cleared. And there is a lot of development that's occurring that doesn't contribute to coverage. It's flagstone. And you're right, a lot of those contractors didn't really know that they perhaps needed a permit to do that work. But I think word is spreading. I think more and more of the contractors are aware that they need this. I don't think it slows the process down. As I said, it's a fairly quick turnaround for a development permit.
Someone is wondering if there was ever a formal report showing if the permitting system yielded better outcomes. For example, there were additional kilometers of shoreline protected or enhanced.
I can't say that there's been a report that's really coming out after. As I mentioned, Lake of Bays has been using this system for, over 20 years. So it's one of the things that I feel like a lot of people are trying to do what Lake of Bays has been doing for the last 20 years. I feel like the problem that some places may have is trying to, pull back the development that's currently happening in their waterfront. Things have always happened, and now they're being told they can't do those types of things. How much more of the buffer along the lakes has been revegetated? I don't know. What I do feel is that Lake of Bays has prevented 20 years of trees from being removed in the waterfront area. But no, nobody has gone out to look at what the existing situation was in 2001 versus now.
And the next one is, if the system, do you think that there are any advantages of using this system that outweigh the loss of a potential appeal by those who are disappointed with the outcome of a decision?
Sorry, ask that question one more time.
Sure.
Outweigh the appeal.
Yeah, the advantages of using this system outweigh the loss of a potential appeal by those who are disappointed with the decision.
I think, like I said, I did mention that it's only the owners. So there is the situation where if an owner is upset with a decision, they can still appeal the application. I think that, there is still a process for a council variation, and the council variation is something that is definitely much greater than staff in terms of percentage, and it's the mitigation of off-site impacts. So if somebody comes to a council meeting and requests additional plantings or perhaps a greater setback, I feel that a lot of people do work together to achieve something that would have less of an impact off-site. Have there been instances where people might have appealed? As I said, they're not zoning amendments. They're not large, not always large in terms of the numbers that you're looking at. So in my 5 years, has there been a situation that potentially may have been appealed? Not that I'm aware of. I still think that, council does treat these as a public meeting essentially, and people do have the ability to speak at these meetings, and council does listen to them and implements different measures that they'd like to see, like I said, in terms of retention of additional vegetation, or greater setbacks if that's what's being looked at. But like I said, the parameters for what staff and council is set into the bylaw.
Wonderful. So as of right now, that's all of the questions. We will give people one more minute in case you want to sneak in one last question. But in the meantime, I will drop a link to a short survey. So if everyone is able to take a few minutes before you head off for your night and just let us know how it was tonight, if it was what you thought it would be, and if you have any ideas for future webinars, that can help us with the launch of our 2022 series. And I'm also going to drop Melissa and Darlene's emails in the chat. So if you think of any questions for either of them, overnight or in the middle of the night, you can send them an email tomorrow morning. Darlene is the policy intern with Watersheds Canada, and she is in the middle of developing that best management practices website, like she mentioned at the beginning. So if there's something that you think would be really beneficial to be included in there, you can always send her an email, give her an idea, or just talk through something. She is always, I think like Melissa, very excited to talk about policy. So she would be happy, Darlene would be happy to talk to people. And I will just share my screen one more time. I did mention we would be sharing some past resources. So earlier in the year, we had Christopher from Watersheds Canada talk about the Planning for Our Shorelines project, and that's where he goes into that really in-depth analysis of the Future of Our Shores report. So you can view the report and the webinar on the Planning for Our Shorelines website. We also have a number of different handouts and webinars that cover the importance of shoreline buffers, both in terms of wildlife and also protecting shoreline property values and not losing the land into the water from different threats. So all of those resources are available again at watersheds.ca/freshwater-stewardship. And I would like to invite everyone to a year-end celebration. On December 9th, we're going to be taking a look back at what happened in 2021 at Watersheds Canada, thanks to the support of all of our individual donors, businesses, and community partners, and see the impact that we're having for Canada's freshwater. So you can now register for that event. It is December 9th, which is a Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be on Zoom. Also recorded if you're not able to attend it live, but we're really excited to just take a moment, a breath, and see all of the great work that everyone is doing to protect shoreline habitat and in water habitat as well. So you are all welcome to come to that event. I don't think there are any more questions in the chat, so we will finish a few minutes early. People are echoing it in the chat. Thank you so much, Melissa, for your time tonight, for your amazing presentation. Very excellent example Lake of Bays is setting. And I think that many people are looking to it as a way to build something in their own municipality. So I thank you very much for your time and everyone for tuning in.